Hello and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, you will learn step by step how to create your first trigger in PostgreSQL using the create trigger statement. What do you need to create a trigger? So to create a trigger in PostgreSQL, you need a couple of things. First, you need to create a trigger function using the create function statement. That's the first requirement. The second requirement is to bind the trigger function. Once it has been created, you bind that to a table using the create trigger statement. So these are the two requirements you need to create a PostgreSQL trigger. So let's take a look at the syntax you would use to create a trigger function. So a trigger function basically is similar to an ordinary function, except that it does not take any arguments and has return value type trigger. So this is a typical syntax of how to create a trigger. So a trigger function, basically you start with a create function keyword followed by the word trigger underscore function, and then you have the return trigger as. So that's basically the syntax for creating a trigger. You can create trigger functions using any languages supported by the PostgreSQL. So what happens here is that the trigger function receives data about their calling environment through a special structure called trigger data, which contains a set of local variables. For example, you can have a variable called old and new, and that represents the states of the row in the table before or after the triggering event. So you have the state of the data before the trigger occurred and after the trigger. So basically you have a before and after. Once a trigger function has been created, you can bind it to any action on a table. So once you've defined the trigger, the other thing left to do is to bind it to specific actions on a table for it to be effective. To create a new trigger, you will need to use the create trigger statement. So this is the syntax here to create a new trigger. So you start with the create trigger statement. The complete syntax of the create trigger can be a bit complex because it has many options. So for the sake of illustration, I'm just using this basic simple form to illustrate how the create trigger syntax should work. So basically you have the statement create trigger followed by the name. You have to give the trigger a name. Then there is a before action and there's an after action. You also got is instead of, and then this is the event, and then the table on which you're performing the trigger on. So I'm going to explain all this in a minute. So the event, you notice I've got event here. The event could be anything, like it could be an insert when something's inserted into a table. It could be an update. It could be a delete, or it could even be a truncate statement. So you can define trigger that fires before, okay, or after an event. The instead of basically is used only for inserts. When you're doing insert, you use the instead of. So you use this instead of only for insert statement, update statement, or delete on views. So if you're dealing with views, if you want to insert something into views, if you want to update a view or delete a view, then you can use the instead of. As I've earlier explained, there are two kinds of triggers. You have the row level trigger and the statement level trigger, which can be specified for each row, which is what I've indicated here, for each row, which indicates the row level trigger, or for each statement, which indicates the statement level trigger. This execute procedure basically is what will fire off the trigger function. So before we can create the trigger, I want to create a new table first. So I'm going to create a couple of tables, and I'm going to then define a new function and then the trigger. So I'm going to do it in that order. So let's create the tables. I'm going to use the pgadmin tool. So it's trying to launch. When you open up the pgadmin, you may get a message come up like this. The pgadmin tool gets updated every so often, so your version may become outdated. It says here I'm currently running 1.4 of the pgadmin 4, but there is a recent version. I'm not going to update it for now because it's not going to impact on this course, so I'm going to skip that and update it at my convenience. I'm just going to X out of that, and I'll log into the server by clicking on the plus and wait, and then click on this Postgres again, click on the plus, and if you haven't saved your password previously, it will prompt you each time you're trying to log on. So once you're logged on, you see the dashboard. So expand the databases on the left and give the database time to populate. I've got 3 databases. So the database I'm going to create the table on is this one called DVD rental. So I'm going to right click on it and click on this query tool, and that will launch the query editor. So the query editor is basically where I'm going to write and execute the script. You can see here on the title bar, it says DVD rental on PostgreSQL. So basically saying that any script I write here will be executed against this this database here called DVD rental. And the database has got one schema called public. And if I expand that, you can see all the objects within that schema. And these are all the tables in that schema. All right, so let's go ahead and create a couple of tables. So this is the first table I'm creating here. It's called employees. I haven't got any tables here called employees for this database, so that should be cool. So basically it's a simple table called employees. It's got the ID is a primary key. It's got first name column, last name column of the varchar data type with a maximum character limit of 40. And I've got it not null, which means this is a constraint. That means the values for these 2 columns cannot be null. You must provide the value. So let me execute this and create the table by clicking on this lightning bolt. See if it will do that. So it says query returned successfully. So it's created the table. Let's just refresh. Right click on these tables here and click refresh, and the name of the table should pop up. There you go. So we've got employees. If I expand that, we can see the columns of the table. There you go. So these are all the columns of this table, which is this 3 here. Excellent. So now that I've created a table, when you're doing triggers, you can create 2 tables. That is if the table you want to use is not already there, but it's always good to have an alternate table for audit purposes, so that any changes you make, the audit table will capture the before and after change. So basically, when an employee's name changes, I want to be able to log it into a separate table. I'm going to create a separate table called employee audit. So the purpose of this second table I want to create here is that when the trigger fires off, it will dump some data into this table, which will show me the change that was made before and after the trigger. So let me highlight this table and create it. All right, there you go. So it says return successfully. So if I refresh the table list, we should have a table called employee audit. So I should have two tables, one for employee, there you go, employee audit and employees. So I'm going to set a trigger on this table so that any changes I make, for example, when an employee gets married, like a female employee, they would change their name. So we want to be able to log, we want a trigger to go off that would log the changes into this table called employee audit. Okay, so I'm going to end this lecture here because it's gone on for quite a while. In the next lecture, we're going to complete the creation of the trigger. So I've now created the table. Next thing I'm going to do in the next lecture, I'm going to create the function and then I'll create the trigger. So see you in the next lecture. Bye for now.